Tanner's talk apparently blends right into Amy's talk, which is really clever, like we planned it. And what Amy is going, as I said, you can look at her biography on here, but I did just read her Wikipedia page just a few minutes ago, and I want you to know that she's an Olympic skater. She has been to, she's on the top list for, what was it, astronaut training? Is that what it was? I think that's what it was. And I think she has several gold medals. At least I have that written on the Wikipedia page. And of course, everybody knows how accurate Wikipedia is because, you know, I mean, we've got a whole room of people who edit Wikipedia. So I wanted to make sure that you saw that she does have a Wikipedia page as well as Tanner. And you can check it out. A lot more information on there for you guys to peruse when you get a chance. As well as people will be hanging out and we can be talking today, tomorrow, and so on. So, okay. So Amy's all set. She says she's ready to go. Yeah, there's something right here behind her. Oh, it says Iowa State University right there. You may or may not know, I actually have a degree in social history. I've never used it for anything. And that's why I do the Wikipedia stuff, because I am really, really, really interested in history and social history. So Amy's talk is going to probably be my favorite today. No pressure. No pressure. Okay, so that's for you. All right, I'll give you Amy. All right, it's casual. Now, at some of these other conferences, you'll be all on it.
I should mention a couple things before I get started. First of all, this is a tag team talk. Tanner and I, 2 different disciplines, 2 different universities, but at this point, we've been together for 35 years. I'd like to think that his moving towards the history of science has a little bit of something to do with being together for 35 years with a historian of science, and my moving more towards skepticism probably has something to do with being together for 35 years with somebody who's been involved with that. So we do our own research and writing, but we come together occasionally for collaborative projects, and this is one of them, which is the second thing I want to mention. This talk here is really very much a work in progress. Tanner and I are hoping to see if there's a chance really to develop this into an article, maybe for Skeptical Inquirer, maybe for an academic journal in philosophy of science, or both, but we really would love your feedback. So, okay, having said that, why skeptics should care about pseudo engineering. So, as Tanner's talk and the others have already shown, the skeptics community spends a lot of time thinking about science versus pseudoscience. And of course, there's also a lot of attention to medicine and alternative medicine. But part of my identity is as a historian of engineering and technology, and at some point it just started grating on me, why is it always science and pseudoscience? Is there such a thing as pseudo engineering? And if so, what would that look like?
Ooh.
And Tanner and I have been batting this idea around for a little bit, and it connects to kind of what he was saying in his talk about the relationship between pure and applied science. And I think we can maybe make the case that if anything, it should be more relevant for the skeptical community to talk and think about engineering versus pseudo-engineering as opposed to science versus pseudoscience, because a lot of what the broader public really cares about when they think about all this is the applied science, medicine, and technology. You pick your random person off the street, she's not going to care a lot about the more esoteric technical details of particle physics. What they really care about is the technology in their pocket and whether they can get decent health care at a price they can afford, and how you know what's decent, and how you know it's good technology, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, also, as I tell my students, you pick up any paper, pretty much the New York Times on any day of the week, you're going to find something about technology pretty much on the front page. And of course, as we know all too well, technology and medicine provide such ready details for distortion, fake scams, and conspiracies, precisely because they're more close to people's everyday lives. So that's sort of where we're hoping to go with this. So start with pseudoscience.
No, keep going. No, so we'll pass things back and forth once in a
We'll
while.
stand very close together.
Okay.
Pick you up.
Okay, so generally when you're talking about a question about pseudoscience, especially for people interested in the history of this, you go through a history of pretenders to scientific stratus. So there are things like phrenology that you have in mind, or other classic things like astrology, psychoanalysis, parapsychology, and so forth. And as I mentioned in my talk before, the so-called demarcation problem, how to tell real from fake science apart, has been a classic problem in the philosophy of science. And the way philosophers have often approached this question was through consulting the history of science as a source of data. Look at the case studies of these things and try and find out what went wrong, what were the sort of institutional screw-ups that happened that would allow us to call these things fake science rather than real science. And of course, anytime you do something like that, you get plenty of ambiguities along the way as well, which is sometimes what makes it most interesting. So when you're doing with something like alternative medicine, again, one of the big concerns for the skeptical community today, again, you can look at the history of differing claims to medical knowledge, like homeopathy back in the day, in the 19th century, in that context, was actually quite plausible to begin with. Today it's crazy. Therapeutic touch, which is still apparently has a hold among some nursing students. I sometimes get nursing students in my science and pseudoscience class, and I ask them whether they learn about therapeutic touch, and sometimes yes. Psychic healing, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of these. And again, you get these case studies and ambiguities, but one of the interesting things, particularly when you bring applied science in the picture, is this. Because applied science is about achieving particular outcomes. It's about the applications, not just knowledge for knowledge's sake. That means their purposes are a little bit different than what you might call basic science. For example, in medicine, it's not a matter of just obtaining biomedical knowledge as if you just cared about, I don't know, cell biology just for cell biology's sake, but also attaining this thing called health. And health is not some sort of pure scientific term. It's very much a value-laden, socially complex. And so when you're talking about something like health, talking about pseudoscience with the implication that science just cares about the facts, it becomes an overly broad term. We need something a little bit better than pseudoscience. So therefore, perhaps pseudo engineering might work that way.
Okay, so one of the things that Taner and I have been wrestling with is this question of how do you define pseudo engineering? And we've been thinking about whether some things that we talk about pseudoscience might be better classed as pseudo-engineering, same thing with alternative medicine. And really, it's the commercial and technological context here that's important, because it's not this matter of seeking explanations in some abstract world, something that works on the blackboard. The real test is whether or not it's useful. We were talking before about the definition of applied science. Engineers usually think of themselves as problem solvers, creative problem solvers. So who cares about all this? Well, I'm coming at this as a historian, and I think this is also part of the view of a lot of the skeptical community. By analyzing fake science, pseudoscience, that helps us learn a little bit more about the nature of science itself. For scientists, it's a matter of professional integrity and defending the boundaries and defending truth, however you want to define that, fighting fake science. And for skeptics, what Taner was just saying, even though it's outdated, often that rhetoric of falsifiability is at least a good place to start thinking about some of this, but there's also the matter of protecting against fraud, and then the institutional role of places like CSI. Okay, so again, what I'd argue is that just as we need to understand science to really start thinking about pseudoscience, you also want to understand engineering to start thinking about pseudo-engineering. And as Tanner said, it's not just some abstract body of knowledge, these are human creations. That's the first thing I tell my students in every class, that technology and engineering were not created in some vacuum. You always need to understand the social context, the historical background of the time in which they were created. So my history of technology class literally goes back and starts with stone tools. But I condense it for the students, and to condense it even further here, the word engineering literally comes from the Latin word ingenieria, which means to devise, but it's significant the way that was first used. It was really first applied in the late 1300s in Europe in the term ingeniarius, which specifically usually referred to someone who created siege engines. In other words, engineering as a discipline started as military engineering. But the interesting thing there too is that these really first generation of engineers, if you want to think of them that way, didn't have the disciplinary boundaries that your modern university has between different branches of engineering. As a matter of fact, these engineers were really what we think of when we think of the term Renaissance man, because their engineering understanding was inseparable from the knowledge of art and architecture. We'll get to Leonardo da Vinci in just a minute. But really, where they found their employment was in going into the service for some rich patron, particularly in devising military solutions for them. Because Italy at this time was divided into separate city-states that were in a constant state of war with each other. So it really was an arms race for these different nobles and princes to get the best engineer they could on their side, who they helped would come up with the latest siege engines and the best military tools. So one thing a lot of people don't realize is, you mentioned Leonardo da Vinci and everybody knows who he is. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Leonardo was not some singular genius who sprang out of nowhere, just the opposite. There were a number of other men of his era, and they were all men, who really had the same type of background, who were studying the same types of questions. And as a matter of fact, a lot of these guys did something Leonardo never did, which was publish their work, so that others, including Leonardo, could and did learn from it. So there's a whole series of them. These are important to the history of engineering. A fellow named Conrad Kaiser, who develops a lot of designs, and there's a lot of plagiarism, copying from each other, building on each other for siege engines and firearms, and what he promises are wondrous secrets of war. There's Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who's notable for coming up with these new designs of star fortifications, because they realize that your classic medieval castle is absolutely no good at all once you get cannon that can punch a cannonball right through a thin wall. And Leonardo read Francesco's work and was influenced by it in a lot of Leonardo's thinking about military engineering. So Leonardo da Vinci is a classic case for thinking about engineering and institutions and power, because Leonardo had to find some way to get support, to get money. No such thing as the NSF, so he was in service as the resident engineer and also a sideline artist and entertainer for the Duke of Milan, the King of France, Caesar Borgia, who refers to him as a very excellent and favorite private architect and engineer general, and orders all other engineers under Caesar Borgia's area to confer with Leonardo and conform to his orders. I usually have my students read the letter that Leonardo sent to the Duke of Milan asking for employment, and I tell them, if you're applying for jobs, start looking at this cover letter. So what it comes down to, though, is not just engineering and war, but also engineering and economics. because Leonardo, even though everybody focuses on the fabulous designs he comes up with, most of which would never have worked for things like a flying machine or a scuba apparatus, Leonardo also has a lot of less flashy designs in his notebooks for things like water pumps and practical equipment. And there are, again, other men of his time, people like Bertuccio, Agricola, who really focus on this, the technology of mining, the technology of metallurgy. They're thinking about things like ventilation of mines, the casting of metals, and again, they wrote and published books with illustrations to explain this technology. Another key part of the context is the evolution of patent law, where you have a system created by the state to encourage invention. In other words, to promote progress. You give the inventor a certain incentive by giving them a monopoly over the discover a finite period of time, but no more, because you want others to be able to build on it. And of course, that's crucial for the later Industrial Revolution. So, jumping forward at a glance about 500 years, engineering really becomes professionalized in the late 1800s, which not coincidentally is the same time that you have professionalization of law, economics, history, a lot of the other academic and professional worlds. So you have the separation of engineering into different disciplines. They become codified with their own journals, their own ethics, their own philosophies, their own licensing rules. But always this question of institutional context. Who's employing engineers? That shapes what they do. It shapes the questions they ask. It shapes the answers they came up with. Not coincidentally, starting in the late 1800s, going into the early 20th century, more and more engineers are employed by major corporations and research institutions like Bell Labs. Many engineers also, not coincidentally, are being promoted to management, promoted to upper levels, which at some point means you don't actually do hands-on engineering anymore. But what this led to really was what historians have called an early 20th century valorization of engineers. In the early 1900s, you have all sorts of radio programs and children's books and magazine articles about these heroic inventors and engineers who are building railroads through the deserts in Africa, pushing roads through the jungles in Latin America. There are again, all sorts of accounts about real-life engineers and their hair-raising adventures to make engineering seem glamorous, like the cutting edge of progress. And not coincidentally, President Herbert Hoover, one of his many nicknames, was the great engineer, because before becoming president, he made his name and fortune as a mining engineer. He did actually have some pretty interesting adventures. But again, it's that certain respect for technological knowledge, because engineers in the early 1900s were associated with authority. And one thing that's useful to know is that this still persists in many other countries more strongly than in the United States, particularly in the Middle East. You have engineers still sort of representing this ideal of the educated class and authority. But this idea of engineering as equated to modern progress really gets built into a lot of culture and thought of the 20th century. And you can still see that when I talk to my engineering students in particular. They take it as an unquestioned assumption that the world is built on progress. And they say things just keep getting better and better. And if you push them on that, they'll say, okay, we have faster computers, we have smaller and more affordable cell phones. And to try to get them to think critically about that can sometimes really be a real battle. You have to push them to ask, as one historian has put it, progress for whom? Progress for what? To really unpack that idea. But the world of engineering really became built around these assumptions of progress. And one good place to see that, okay, here I'm going into full history nerd mode, but the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair. As I tell my students, think about the timing. 1930s Great Depression, 25% unemployment. A lot of observers, labor unions, social scientists, even politicians, including President Franklin Roosevelt, were looking at that 25% unemployment and saying, wait a minute, we've been mechanizing faster than ever before. Factories are being mechanized, production of everything from cigars to food has been mechanized, telephones are switching from a human operator to an automatic dial system, silent pictures with orchestras and musicians are being replaced by talking movie pictures. Is it a coincidence that we've been mechanizing production and we have 25% unemployment? So there was talk about taking a research holiday, what some called a science holiday, pausing science in order to, they said, give society a chance to adjust, a chance to catch up. The trick is, again, they were talking about a science holiday, but really what they were thinking about was technology, engineering, mechanization. And the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair really served as a chance for big corporations, including the engineers who worked for those big corporations, to defend themselves against this call to pause research, to defend the world of science. And they did it not by pointing to science, but by pointing to technology, engineering. Their defense against the criticism of science at the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair was to point to technology. Westinghouse put a humanoid robot on display. It couldn't really do that much, but everybody knew robots represented progress, right? General Motors had this famous exhibit, Futurama, saying that the world of 1960 would have 8-lane superhighways, which is still kind of mind-boggling when you live in Kirksville, Missouri, but then you get someplace like here and you realize that, in fact, 8-lane superhighways do exist. So they defended science by saying technology in the hands of big corporations will give you all these future wonders. And you can see the same thing continuing into the Cold War. The criticism, the debate over science education, in some ways comes down to technology, the arms race against the Soviet Union, the space race, and of course the famous kitchen debate between Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev over which country actually gave its housewives, as I referred to them then, the best consumer appliances and television. So, the idea that engineering and invention represented modern wonders, we can fly like the birds, we can put a man on the moon, inevitably, as you know, it leads to these questions. So if we can put a man on the moon, why don't we have free energy? Why don't we have perpetual motion machines? Why don't we have cars that can get 200 miles to the gallon? And of course, as you know, the answer in some quarters is we could have all this, but they are keeping these secret from you. And that engineers, because they're silent about all this, they must be part of the conspiracy. So let's start with free energy.
Okay. Now, one of the classic things that you encounter as an example of, fake science and engineering is free energy claims. Somebody who says, hey, here's this device and it produces more energy than it takes to run, and therefore if you have this device, you can actually disconnect yourself from the electric grid. You will never pay another cent to the power company and things like that. Now, if you have a claim of free energy like that today, and it comes to, say, university environment, it's probably going to come to the physics department. And knowing my interests, this sort of thing will probably in our area come to me if it ever comes to that. And if it comes to a physicist, well, probably the first thing we do is we think of this in the context of a perpetual motion machine, because there's a long history of this. And it's very, very important in the development of thermodynamics, which is one of the very fundamental physical ideas. And today, if you have an over-unity generator or claim like that, it is the modern equivalent of a perpetual motion machine. And if you bring it to a physicist like me, I'm going to say, first of all, I'm going to be very, very suspicious of this, because I'm going to expect that you're not going to be able to violate the laws of thermodynamics. These is some very serious shit for a physicist. And also, as a physicist, I'm going to know that experimental setups for calorimetry, where you need to measure the energy balance, are very, very tricky. In fact, in living memory, we've had important debacles like the Cold Fusion fiasco, which turned on the difficulty of doing calorimetry and things like that. And so with free energy, if I were to, it's never happened to me yet, but if anybody brought a free energy device to me, to our physics department, I'm going to suspect fraud first thing. It's probably going to be a concealed battery there somewhere. And my advice to you is going to be, do not invest in this guy's invention. This is not a maverick inventor looking for some investment funds to get things off in their garage. This is fraud. So yeah, this is actually, the device is probably going to look something like this these days, pulled from one of the zillions of YouTube videos out there that are free energy machines. But here's the thing though, it's actually more complicated than that. Once you start getting to look into free energy claims today, they're not quite as vulnerable as I might have first thought of to the sort of classical physicist type of response. Because your typical free energy promoter today will actually avoid thermodynamics altogether. They will say something like, no, we are not actually producing more energy than you put in. We're actually tapping into an unknown source of energy. And a very common candidate that they have today is the quantum zero-point energy of the quantum vacuum. Now, this is, again, I mean, this is bullshit, but they are not claiming to violate the laws of thermodynamics. Very often, in fact, what will happen with your sort of stereotypical garage inventor for free energy is that they will avoid physical theory altogether. All that they will be claiming is, it works. It produces more energy. I don't care where it comes from.
Hang on, this is the announcement you're going to be doing for
They're going to
the
make this announcement
library.
a few times, just ignore it.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
the library is closing, but it's not for
We're
us.
not closing.
Okay.
Sorry, I forgot to warn you.
Yeah,
Not a problem.
I was first when I knew about it. Yeah, exactly.
It'll happen a few more times.
Sure. Anyway, the basic idea is that free energy today is actually not something that will come my way in the guise of faking science. They will do very little faking science. In fact, this whole story of an inventor in the garage who needs investment but is worried that the idea will be stolen by big tech or big academia and so forth, and so therefore they won't reveal the details. This has a lot to do with tech culture. This is not scientific culture. This is really tech engineering. So, in a sense, we should not maybe even be thinking even of applied science, which free energy is faking over here. This is maybe pseudo engineering. It is maybe analogous to pseudoscience, fake science, but it may be a different animal in its own right. And so therefore maybe we should look at this a little bit differently. So, back to Amy.
Okay, so switching gears, again, the skeptic community has done a lot over the years with the history of alternative medicine. But again, when you start looking at it more closely, it's not just alternative medicine, it's alternative technologies that claim to have a medical cure. So there's a long history of this with cancer cures. If you go back to the late 1800s, there was an absolute obsession with the seemingly magical power of electricity. So there are all sorts of incredible devices out there for electrohomeopathy and electric devices that promise to do everything from restore brain power to restore virility. There's magnetic therapy, light and polarity therapy, radio wave generators. Some of you may have heard about orgone boxes. And again, you know, it's technologies just as much as it is medicine, and they rely on these mysteries of technology and this idea of progress and technology representing something out there. Last year we were in Sedona, Arizona. We were there for the hiking, but I happened to pick up the local tourist magazine, and every other page was one of these places promising some type of magical medical cure, and inevitably they revolved around some type of technology. And of course, you know, present day, we have all sorts of more recent case studies of devices or tools that have promised something significant in the way of unparalleled opportunities to improve your health, Zoetron therapy, you remember the Theranos debacle, and of course one of the ultimate conspiracy theories, med beds. Some of you may have encountered this popular idea now that there exists these secret devices, a medical bed where you lie down on it and it instantly diagnoses whatever is wrong with you and instantly cures it. Only they are keeping the knowledge from you. Okay, one of the reasons why all this works is that healing itself, as Tanner said, the notion of health and the whole process of healing is so complicated. There's the physical process interacting with the psychological process, interacting with your social, family, personal, and economic context. And healing can be ambiguous, right? What is perfect health? How do you know if you're really cured for good? How do you even know what's really going on inside your own body? Fit that in with distrust of mainstream medicine that has been around in different quarters for literally decades, but in recent years has been growing, as we know, for various reasons. And then factor in that when they're sick, people are scared. They're in distress. You don't always know who to trust. You don't always have the energy or the strength to do a lot of your own in-depth, detailed, reliable research. People are desperate. And so these are some of the reasons why medical technologies built on the flimsiest of jargon or pretenses to engineering can still have this important appeal. But beyond scams, we could do this whole history of pseudo engineering as scams, whether it's orgone boxes or Theranos or perpetual motion machines, and all that makes good stories. But beyond that, I think there's something else going on with the history of pseudo-engineering, and that's the way it's weaponized this idea of engineering authority to challenge other forms of mainstream authority and question historical narratives. And I would argue that pseudo-engineering has become a key part of a lot of today's modern conspiracy thinkings, precisely because technology is such a part of our everyday world. So, again, handing back over to Tanner.
And once you start looking for this sort of thing, you start finding all sorts of examples all over the place. One of the examples I'm going to bring up right now is actually some work that Amy and I did together about a dozen years ago. And this was had to do with false claims of early flight. It turns out that because engineering, technology is very much sort of associated with high prestige and power and things like that, in parts of the Muslim world in particular, there have been claims for a long time that actually somehow Muslims had invented flight centuries ago before the Wright brothers and everything like that. This has to do with the local sort of national pride and everything like that. There are two very prominent examples. One is the Andalusian Arab Ibn Firnas, who was supposed to have done this flight in the 9th century. And also in Turkey, in Istanbul, Hazarfen Ahmet Çelebi was supposed to have jumped from a tower with wings made of bird feathers and everything like that. And the stories that exist are very unreliable historical documentation, and really has much more to do with magic than anything we'd recognize as science. But if you look at it in a context of technology, this is very much a sort of a fake technology type of story. That lens is probably more useful than thinking of this as faking the science part.
Okay, so again, jumping a few centuries at once, you can see the same pseudo-engineering thinking if you look at the conspiracy theories about having faked the moon landing. You know all of them, all of the claims that it can't have been a real moon landing because the flag is waving, because you can't see the stars in the background, because there's no blast crater. Again, once you look at them closely, they're easy to analyze, but still pseudo-engineering. And then you had the whole 9/11 episode. as many of you may remember, that unfortunately led to a lot of conspiracies that this had been staged, and a lot of the discussion of that really revolved around what I would call pseudo-engineering claims. You know, the accusations that, well, the jet fuel wouldn't have been burning hot enough to bring down the towers, therefore it must have been a planted device. Oh, the hole in the wall of the Pentagon wasn't big enough to be a real jumbo jet, therefore it must have been staged. So it brings in discussion of materials, it brings in discussion of structural engineering, and you really had this movement where you had one set of people claiming engineering knowledge, challenging what they saw as mainstream conspiracy thinking. All sorts of other conspiracies that we can get into where technology is the center rather than science, whether it's weather control, lasers, chemtrails, or stuff about the 5G towers supposedly causing COVID or causing cancer. And again, all the talk is about tech, magnetic fields, so pseudo-engineering there. This feeds into bigger factors that we all know in the skeptical world: suspicion of elites, suspicion of higher education, business and government. But the thing that worries me is the question of how much worse all of this is going to get. We were talking about it just over lunch. In the age of AI, with fakery, with high-tech hype. We just came down from San Francisco, where it seems that every single billboard and advertisement is pushing AI, and it's grating on us because AI is absolutely murdering higher education. Don't get me started on that. But anyway, this bigger picture, this broader discussion, this broader picture of distrust of vaccines and high-tech medicine, combined with the current defunding of scientific research. So, what does all this mean? What does it all add up to?
Okay, so we're winding down right now, as you can see, and as I said, this is something of a work in progress. I'm hoping that you will offer us your criticism and ideas and things like that. But one reason we think that bringing in an engineering rather than a science focus on this whole thing might be valuable is this. Examining the history and philosophy of fake science, alternative medicine, the type of things that skeptics often care about, is actually, I think, a very valuable tool in helping us to understand science and medicine as intellectual enterprises, cultural institutions. So sometimes the best way to learn about the real thing is to find some examples of fakes and see what you can learn from them. So if there's a lot of faking of engineering going on, then therefore maybe a similar sort of skeptical study of pseudo-engineering, it may give us very interesting questions about the nature of engineering and invention, which may be valuable to look at. So therefore, thank you. We really do want your input. Even the idea of how to define pseudo-engineering is something we're still tossing around ideas with. Nothing here is set in stone yet. I don't know how much we can import from our understanding of pseudoscience and alternative medicine to pseudo-engineering. Presumably, we need a lot more case studies and things like that. If you can think of something that might be applicable, I'd love to hear about it. But by and large, I think this has some potential to work from a perspective of thinking about the history and nature of engineering, invention, really in a wider context than often what has been done so far. So that's it.
And I don't know if we have any time for
We have a few minutes.
A few minutes. Okay.
If you have questions, go ahead and ask.